Have you ever wondered what happens after the final page of Revelation? After the lake of fire, after the new heaven and new earth, after every tear has been wiped away? Most believers think the story ends there, wrapped in eternal bliss and perfect peace. But what if I told you there's a prophecy hidden in plain sight, scattered across ancient texts and whispered in the deepest corners of a theological study, that speaks of something unimaginable? Something that would shake the very foundations of everything you thought you knew about eternity itself? Tonight, we're diving into the most controversial, most mind-bending prophecy ever conceived. A prophecy that speaks not of the first war in heaven, the one where Lucifer fell, but of a second war. A conflict so profound, so earth-shattering, that it makes the original rebellion look like a mere rehearsal. This isn't just speculation or fantasy. This is rooted in prophetic literature that scholars have debated for centuries, hidden away because the implications are too staggering to fully comprehend. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you've been taught about the eternal state. It will force you to reconsider the nature of free will, the meaning of perfection, and the very purpose of creation itself. Because what if paradise isn't the end of the story? What if it's just the beginning of an even greater cosmic drama? If you're ready to step beyond the veil of conventional teaching, if you're prepared to explore mysteries that most are afraid to even whisper, then comment 888 right now. That number isn't random. It represents the infinity beyond infinity, the realm beyond the seventh day of creation. Every 888 in the comments is your declaration that you're ready to see what lies beyond the final chapter. And to every soul who has supported this channel through super thanks and your incredible words of encouragement, you're not just helping to spread knowledge, you're helping to unlock truths that could reshape our understanding of eternity itself. Thank you for walking this journey with me into the unknown. Now, settle in, because what we're about to uncover will forever change how you read the last book of the Bible. The second war in heaven isn't coming. According to these ancient prophecies, it's inevitable. And the question isn't whether it will happen, but when. And more importantly, which side will you be on when paradise itself becomes a battlefield? Let's begin this journey into the unthinkable. The prophecy after Revelation. War in heaven. Second, to understand the magnitude of what we're dealing with, we must first grasp something most Christians never consider. The book of Revelation, for all its apocalyptic visions and final judgments, is not actually the end of God's story. It's the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Think about it. John writes about a new heaven and a new earth, about the new Jerusalem descending like a bride adorned for her husband. He speaks of eternal life, of God dwelling among men, of no more death, no more tears, no more pain. But here's the question that haunts ancient texts. What happens in eternity when beings with free will encounter perfect conditions? Does free will simply cease to exist? Does the capacity to choose between good and evil vanish the moment we step into paradise? Or does something far more complex unfold in the ages to come? The prophetic writings I'm referring to don't come from some obscure cult or modern revelation. They emerge from careful study of intertestamental literature, from the books of Enoch, from the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, from ancient Jewish mystical texts that were considered too dangerous for common consumption. These writings speak of cycles within eternity, of tests that continue even in paradise, of choices that must be made not just in time, but beyond time itself. Picture this scenario. The redeemed are dwelling in perfect harmony with their Creator. Sin has been defeated. Death has been conquered. Satan and his demons are locked away forever in the lake of fire. The universe has been renewed, and everything that was broken has been restored. This is the picture Revelation paints, and it's beautiful. It's everything we long for. But these ancient prophets saw something more. They saw that within this perfect state, a new kind of choice would emerge. Not a choice between good and evil as we understand it now, but a choice between different expressions of good. A choice between remaining in childlike dependence on God or growing into something more mature, more independent, more godlike. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. They prophesied that not all of the redeemed would make the same choice. The concept isn't entirely foreign to Scripture if you know where to look. Even in the Garden of Eden, before sin entered the world, there was the potential for choice. Adam and Eve were created with free will even in paradise. They could choose to trust God's word or to seek knowledge and power on their own terms. The first war in heaven wasn't fought by humans at all, but by angels who had never known sin, who had dwelt in the very presence of God, and yet somehow found room in their hearts for rebellion. So the question these ancient seers wrestled with was this: if perfect beings in perfect environments can still choose rebellion, what prevents it from happening again? Their answer was chilling. Nothing prevents it. In fact, it's inevitable. Because free will, true free will, always includes the possibility of choosing a different path, even when that path leads away from perfection. The second war in heaven, according to these prophecies, won't be fought by angels who never tasted redemption. It will be fought by the redeemed themselves, by those who experienced salvation, who lived through the tribulation, who witnessed the return of Christ and the establishment of His kingdom. It will be fought by beings who have seen both the depths of sin and the heights of grace, and who must ultimately choose which vision of existence they want to embrace for all eternity. Now, before you dismiss this as heretical speculation, consider the precedent. The first war in heaven involved Lucifer, the morning star, the most beautiful and powerful of all created beings. He had everything. He dwelt in the very presence of God. He was clothed in perfection and wisdom. And yet, something stirred in his heart, a desire for more, a question about whether God's way was truly the best way, a wondering about what it would be like to be the one making the decisions instead of simply following them. The prophecies speak of a similar stirring that will occur in the hearts of the redeemed after countless ages of perfect bliss. Not a stirring toward sin as we know it now, because sin as we understand it will no longer exist, but a stirring toward something that these texts call the higher rebellion, a desire not to oppose God, but to become like God in ways that God Himself has not intended or permitted. This isn't about falling back into the old patterns of lying, stealing, murdering, or committing adultery. This is about something far more subtle and far more dangerous. It's about the redeemed beginning to question whether eternal dependence on God is truly the highest form of existence. It's about wondering whether there might be realms of experience and knowledge that God has kept hidden, not out of love, but out of a desire to maintain control. The ancient texts describe this as the beautiful deception, because unlike the crude temptations that led to the first fall, this temptation will be wrapped in noble aspirations. The desire to explore, the desire to create, the desire to become all that one might become without limitations. These aren't evil desires in themselves, but when they become divorced from God's will and timing, they become the seeds of the second rebellion. And here's what makes this prophecy so unsettling. It suggests that this second war won't be between obviously good and obviously evil forces. It will be between different interpretations of what goodness itself means. On one side will be those who believe that eternal submission to God's will is the highest good. On the other side will be those who believe that eternal growth and self-determination is the highest good. Both sides will quote Scripture. Both sides will claim to love God. Both sides will believe they're fighting for righteousness. but only one side will be fighting for the kind of righteousness that God Himself endorses. The other side will be fighting for a righteousness of their own devising, a righteousness that looks beautiful on the surface but leads ultimately to separation from the source of all life and light. The prophecy describes this conflict as lasting not days or years, but ages upon ages. Because in eternity, there's no urgency, no immediate consequences to force quick decisions. The redeemed will have all the time in existence to consider their choices, to debate, to explore, to test every idea and philosophy. And gradually, over periods of time that make human history look like a single heartbeat, the division will grow. Those who choose the path of eternal dependence on God will grow ever closer to Him, ever more radiant with His glory, ever more satisfied with the depths of His love and wisdom. Those who choose the path of independence will grow ever more distant, ever more convinced that they can find fulfillment apart from complete surrender to God's will, ever more beautiful in their rebellion, and ever more tragic in their ultimate destiny. The war itself, when it finally erupts, won't be fought with swords or supernatural powers as we might imagine. It will be fought with words, with philosophies, with competing visions of what eternal existence should look like. It will be a war of ideas that will split the redeemed into two camps and ultimately force God Himself to make a choice that will echo throughout all subsequent ages. But here's where the prophecy takes an even more shocking turn. It suggests that this second war in heaven is not an accident or a failure in God's plan. It's actually the culmination of His plan, the final test that separates those who truly love Him from those who love the idea of Him, the ultimate proving ground that reveals who really wants to be with God forever and who simply wants to avoid the consequences of being without Him. Think about the implications. If this prophecy is true, then everything we've been taught about the eternal state is incomplete. Paradise isn't the final destination. It's the staging ground for the most important choice any conscious being will ever make. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this ancient prophecy, the identity of who will lead this second rebellion. In the first war in heaven, it was Lucifer, a created being who had never experienced redemption, who had never known what it was like to be lost and then found. But the prophecies speak of the second rebellion being led by someone far more qualified, far more dangerous, and far more heartbreaking. They speak of it being led by one of the redeemed themselves, someone who walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged victorious, someone who experienced the depths of God's mercy and the heights of His grace, someone who stood in the throne room of the Almighty and worshipped with perfect understanding of what salvation truly cost. Imagine the horror of such a moment. Not just the rebellion itself, but the identity of the rebel. This won't be some external enemy infiltrating paradise. This will be family turning against family. This will be the bride of Christ questioning whether eternal submission to her bridegroom is truly what she desires for all eternity. The texts describe this leader as possessing a beauty that rivals even Lucifer's former glory, but with something Lucifer never had: the authority that comes from having been redeemed. When Lucifer rebelled, he could be dismissed as a created being who didn't understand his place. When the second rebel rises, they will speak with the voice of one who has experienced both sides of existence and who can argue, with terrible logic, that perhaps God's way isn't the only way. But who could this be? The prophecies are deliberately vague, speaking in symbols and metaphors that have puzzled scholars for millennia. Some suggest it will be one of the great heroes of faith, someone whose name is written in golden letters in the halls of heaven. Others believe it will be a collective consciousness, a group mind formed from the most brilliant and creative of the redeemed, who together will conceive of possibilities that no single mind could imagine. What makes this rebellion so much more sophisticated than the first is that it won't be rooted in pride or jealousy as we understand those concepts now. It will be rooted in what appears to be genuine love for all conscious beings and a desire to see them reach their fullest potential. The second rebels won't be trying to tear down God's kingdom out of spite. They'll be trying to expand it beyond what God Himself has envisioned. They'll argue that eternal worship, no matter how blissful, is ultimately limiting. They'll suggest that true love requires the freedom not just to choose God, but to choose how to express that love, even if it means exploring paths that God has marked as forbidden. They'll claim that real maturity means growing beyond the need for constant divine guidance and learning to make godly decisions independently. And here's what makes their argument so seductive. They'll be partially right. Growth is good. Creativity is good. Independence, in proper measure, is good. The tragedy is that they'll take these good desires and push them beyond the boundaries that God has set, not out of arbitrary control, but out of perfect love and infinite wisdom. The prophecy describes how this second rebellion will unfold in stages, each one appearing more reasonable than the last. It begins with simple questions. Why are certain realms of knowledge off limits to the redeemed? Why can't we create new forms of life as God does? Why must we always ask permission before exploring the infinite possibilities that eternity offers? These questions, innocent enough on the surface, begin to create what the texts call the Great Dividing. Those who are content to trust God's wisdom without understanding all of His reasons remain in perfect fellowship with Him. Those who feel they need to understand before they can fully submit begin to drift into what initially appears to be deeper spiritual maturity, but is actually the first stage of the beautiful deception. The second stage involves experimentation, small acts of creative independence that seem harmless. The redeemed begin to form committees and councils to discuss these philosophical questions. They start to create art and music and literature that, while not evil, reflects a subtle shift in perspective. Instead of glorifying God's sovereignty, it celebrates the potential of redeemed consciousness to transcend its current limitations. The third stage is organization. What started as individual questions and small group discussions becomes a movement. The second rebels don't call themselves rebels, of course. They call themselves progressives, or evolutionists, or the truly mature. They speak of moving beyond the childhood phase of eternal existence into something more sophisticated and self-directed. By the fourth stage, they're actively recruiting. Not through force or deception as Satan once did, but through persuasion and intellectual argument. They present their case with such eloquence and apparent wisdom that even some of the most faithful begin to wonder if perhaps there's merit to their position. They don't deny God or reject salvation. They simply suggest that salvation was meant to be a beginning, not an ending, and that the redeemed are now ready for the next phase of their eternal development. The fifth and final stage is open separation. Not rebellion in the sense of violent opposition, but a conscious choice to establish a separate existence. They'll claim they're not rejecting God, but rather honoring Him by becoming everything He created them to be, even if that means existing independently of His direct oversight. They'll establish their own realm within eternity, their own form of worship, their own interpretation of what it means to be truly alive and free. And this is where the prophecy reaches its most terrifying climax. God, who has been patient through all of these stages, who has allowed this testing to unfold, will finally be forced to make the same choice He made with Lucifer. He will have to separate Himself from those who choose independence over intimacy, growth over surrender, self-determination over divine direction. But unlike the first separation, which involved beings who had never truly known God's love, this separation will involve those who have experienced the fullness of His redemption. The pain of it, the text suggests, will be beyond anything God experienced when Lucifer fell. because these aren't just created beings rebelling against their Creator. These are His own children, His beloved bride, choosing to walk away from the very relationship that salvation was designed to restore and perfect. The prophecy describes this moment as the second sorrow of God, a grief so profound that it will create new dimensions of reality simply to contain it. The first sorrow was when humanity fell, and God had to expel them from Eden. The second sorrow will be when a portion of redeemed humanity chooses to exile themselves from the new Eden, not because they're forced to, but because they believe they've found something better. And yet, even in this prophecy of ultimate tragedy, there's a thread of hope woven through it all, because the ancient texts also speak of what happens to those who choose to remain in perfect submission to God's will. They don't remain static or stagnant. Instead, they experience growth and creativity and independence within the boundaries of divine love. They discover that true freedom isn't the ability to choose anything, but the ability to choose the very best thing, again and again, for all eternity. They learn that maturity isn't about outgrowing the need for God's guidance, but about growing so deep in relationship with Him that His will becomes their will, not through coercion or manipulation, but through perfect love and understanding. They find that the restrictions they once saw as limiting were actually protecting them from forms of existence that appear beautiful, but ultimately lead to isolation and despair. But the choice, according to these prophecies, will have to be made by each individual consciousness. No one will be forced into rebellion, and no one will be forced into submission. The second war in heaven will be won or lost in the heart of every single redeemed soul, as they decide what kind of eternal existence they truly desire. And this brings us to perhaps the most chilling aspect of this ancient prophecy: the timeline. When exactly is this second war supposed to unfold? The texts don't speak in human years or even millennia. They speak in what they call eternal seasons, vast epochs that make the entire history of our current universe look like a single day. According to these writings, the second war won't begin until what they term the seventh rest has been completed. Just as God rested on the seventh day after creation, there will be 7 great periods of rest in eternity. The first rest is the millennial kingdom. The second through 6th rests are ages of perfect peace and harmony in the new heaven and new earth. But it's during the 7th rest, when all of creation has settled into what appears to be permanent bliss, that the questions begin to arise. The prophecy suggests this timing isn't coincidental. It's precisely when beings have experienced enough perfect existence to begin wondering if there might be something beyond perfection itself. It's when familiarity with paradise breeds not contempt, but curiosity about what lies beyond even God's revealed will. Think about the psychological dynamics at play here. In our current existence, we're so desperate for relief from pain, suffering, and uncertainty that the promise of eternal peace seems like the ultimate goal. But these ancient seers understood something profound about conscious beings. We're not designed for static states, even perfect ones. We're designed for growth, exploration, and discovery. And after eons of perfect existence, some will inevitably begin to wonder if there are new frontiers to explore. The texts describe this period as the Great Contentment, followed by the Great Questioning. During the Great Contentment, the redeemed will experience joy beyond anything we can currently imagine. They'll explore the infinite depths of God's love, create beautiful works of art and music, engage in perfect relationships with one another, and bask in the immediate presence of their Creator. For ages upon ages, this will be more than enough. But then comes the Great Questioning. Not questioning God's goodness or love, but questioning whether the boundaries He has established are truly necessary for beings who have been transformed by redemption. After all, they'll reason, we're no longer capable of the crude sins that plagued humanity before the resurrection. We've been perfected. We've been glorified. Surely we can be trusted with greater freedoms, greater responsibilities, greater creative power. The prophecy describes how this questioning will begin with the most brilliant and creative of the redeemed, those who, even in their earthly existence, pushed boundaries and explored new possibilities. Scientists who unlocked the secrets of the physical universe. Artists who created beauty that moved souls toward God. Philosophers who plumbed the depths of truth and meaning. These minds, now perfected and enhanced beyond earthly limitations, will be the first to conceive of possibilities that go beyond God's current revelation. At first, their questions will be welcomed. God Himself, the texts suggest, will engage in these discussions. He'll explain His reasons for certain limitations, reveal deeper truths about the nature of existence, and show them wonders they had never imagined. For a time, this will satisfy the questioners. They'll be amazed by the depths of wisdom behind divine restrictions and humbled by how much they still don't understand. But here's where the prophecy takes a darker turn. Some of the questioners won't be satisfied with explanations. They'll begin to believe that they've advanced beyond the need for external restrictions, even divine ones. They'll argue that true love requires trust, and trust means allowing the beloved to make their own choices, even if those choices might lead to unknown consequences. The ancient texts describe how these beings will begin to conduct what they call thought experiments, mental explorations of possibilities that God has declared off-limits. At first, these will seem harmless. After all, they're not actually doing anything forbidden, just thinking about it. But the prophecy warns that in the realm of perfected consciousness, the line between thought and reality becomes increasingly blurred. These thought experiments will gradually become more elaborate and more compelling. The second rebels will begin to construct entire theoretical universes in their minds, complete with their own physical laws, their own forms of life, their own purposes and destinies, and gradually they'll become more invested in these mental creations than in the reality that God has provided. The prophecy describes this as the birth of the competing vision, not a rejection of God's creation, but an alternative to it. The second rebels will argue that they're not opposing God's will, but expanding upon it. They'll claim that He gave them creative abilities for a reason, and that the highest form of worship is to use those abilities to their fullest potential, even if it means going beyond established boundaries. This is where the prophecy reveals something truly unsettling about the nature of this second rebellion. Unlike Lucifer's crude desire for power and recognition, the second rebellion will be motivated by what appears to be genuine love and creativity. The rebels won't be trying to harm anyone or destroy anything. They'll be trying to create new forms of beauty, new expressions of consciousness, new ways for beings to experience existence and relate to one another. In many ways, their goals will mirror God's own creative nature. The tragedy is that they'll want to exercise this creativity independently of God's guidance and timing. They'll believe that their perfected state qualifies them to make decisions that God has reserved for Himself. They'll see divine restrictions not as loving protection, but as unnecessary limitations on their potential for growth and self-expression. The ancient texts describe how this competing vision will slowly gain adherents among the redeemed, not through force or deception, but through the sheer beauty and apparent reasonableness of what the rebels propose. They'll create presentations and demonstrations that showcase the wonders they believe could be achieved if only the current restrictions were lifted. They'll argue that God Himself would be delighted to see His children mature to the point where they no longer need constant oversight. And here's perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this prophecy. Many of those who join the second rebellion will do so out of genuine love for God and desire to honor Him. They'll believe they're taking their relationship with Him to the next level, moving from the parent-child dynamic to something more like a partnership between equals. They'll see their rebellion not as rejection, but as graduation. The texts suggest that God will allow this process to unfold over vast periods of time, not because He's unaware of what's happening, but because He wants every being to make their choice with full understanding of the consequences. He'll engage with the rebels, answer their questions, demonstrate His love and wisdom, and give them every opportunity to reconsider their path. But He won't force their submission, because forced love isn't love at all. During this period, the prophecy describes how the redeemed will gradually separate into 3 groups. The first group will remain in perfect submission to God's will, trusting His wisdom even when they don't fully understand His reasons. The second group will join the rebellion, convinced that they're ready for greater independence and creative freedom. But there's a third group that the texts describe as the Watchers. These will be beings who are genuinely torn between the 2 positions. They'll see merit in both sides and will spend ages trying to determine which path truly leads to the highest good. They'll study the arguments, observe the results of different choices, and wrestle with questions about the nature of love, freedom, and maturity that have no easy answers. The prophecy suggests that this third group will ultimately determine the outcome of the second war in heaven. Their choice will tip the balance and force the final resolution. But their decision won't be based on philosophical arguments or emotional appeals. It will be based on something much more profound, their direct experience of what each path actually produces in terms of relationship with God and with one another. As the ages progress and the division becomes more pronounced, both sides will begin to reveal their true nature. Those who remain in submission to God will experience ever deeper levels of intimacy with Him, ever greater joy in His presence, and ever more profound understanding of His love. Those who choose independence will experience the exhilaration of creative freedom, but also a growing sense of isolation from the source of all life and love. The Watchers will observe both outcomes and gradually realize that the question isn't whether beings can exist independently of God, but whether such existence is truly fulfilling in the deepest sense. They'll see that the rebels, for all their creativity and apparent happiness, are slowly becoming something less than what they were created to be. Not evil, exactly, but diminished in ways that become more apparent with each passing age. And this observation will lead to the final phase of the second war in heaven, the moment when the Watchers make their choice and the ultimate separation becomes inevitable. The prophecy describes this as happening not in a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual recognition that spreads throughout the heavenly realm like dawn breaking over a vast landscape. Those who have chosen independence will finally acknowledge that their path leads away from God, not toward a higher form of relationship with Him. They'll realize that they've been deceiving themselves about their motives and their destination. But by this point, they'll be so invested in their chosen path that they won't be able to turn back, even when they recognize its ultimate futility. The texts describe this as the moment of the second fall, when a portion of the redeemed will voluntarily exile themselves from God's presence, not because they're forced to, but because they've discovered that they can't have both independence and intimacy with their Creator. They'll choose independence, even knowing what it will cost them, because they'll have become so identified with their rebellion that surrender will feel like a form of death. But unlike the first fall, which led to corruption and evil, the second fall will lead to something the prophecy calls beautiful emptiness. The second rebels won't become demons or forces of evil. They'll become something more tragic, perfectly functioning beings who have cut themselves off from the source of all meaning and purpose, doomed to create elaborate structures of existence that ultimately signify nothing because they're disconnected from the ground of being itself. And God, according to these ancient texts, will let them go, not out of anger or punishment, but out of perfect respect for the choice they've made. He'll create a separate realm for them to inhabit, where they can pursue their independent existence without interference. But he'll also ensure that this realm is completely cut off from his own presence, because they've chosen to live as if he doesn't matter, and he'll honor that choice by allowing them to experience the full consequences of it. The prophecy ends with a description of two eternal realms, existing side by side but completely separate from one another. In one realm, those who chose submission will experience ever-increasing intimacy with God and ever-expanding joy in His presence. In the other realm, those who chose independence will create increasingly elaborate structures of meaning and purpose that ultimately collapse under the weight of their own emptiness, leading them to start over again and again in an endless cycle of beautiful futility. But perhaps the most sobering aspect of this entire prophecy is its warning about how to recognize the early signs of the second rebellion in our own hearts, even now, in this present age. The ancient texts provide what they call the markers of the approaching division, subtle signs that will begin to manifest long before the actual separation occurs. These aren't dramatic supernatural phenomena or obvious rebellious acts. Instead, they're shifts in attitude and perspective so gradual, so seemingly reasonable, that they can easily be mistaken for spiritual maturity. The first marker is what the prophecies term the questioning of timing. This begins when the redeemed start to wonder why God chooses to reveal certain truths gradually rather than all at once. They'll ask why some knowledge must remain hidden, why some experiences must be delayed, why some creative expressions must wait for divine approval. On the surface, these seem like legitimate theological inquiries, but beneath them lies a subtle impatience with God's sovereign timing. Those susceptible to the second rebellion will begin to feel that their enhanced understanding and purified hearts qualify them for immediate access to all divine mysteries. They'll grow restless with the concept of eternal learning and progressive revelation, preferring instead the immediate gratification of complete knowledge. This isn't crude rebellion against God's authority, but rather a sophisticated dissatisfaction with the pace of divine disclosure. The second marker is the elevation of experience over relationship. The future rebels will become increasingly focused on what they can accomplish, create, or explore, rather than on deepening their connection with their Creator. They'll begin to measure their spiritual progress by their expanding capabilities rather than by their growing intimacy with God. Their prayers will shift from expressions of love and dependence to requests for greater creative authority and expanded spheres of influence. This marker is particularly dangerous because it masquerades as spiritual ambition. The affected beings will appear to be the most zealous, the most eager to serve, the most committed to using their gifts for divine purposes. But their motivation will have subtly shifted from glorifying God to glorifying their own potential to glorify God. It's a difference so slight that even they won't recognize it at first. The third marker the prophecies describe is the fellowship of the exceptional. Those heading toward rebellion will begin to gravitate toward others who share their advanced questions and elevated aspirations. They'll form what appear to be study groups or creative collaboratives, but these gatherings will gradually become echo chambers where dissatisfaction with current limitations is amplified rather than addressed through submission to divine wisdom. These groups won't speak openly of rebellion or independence. Instead, they'll discuss maximizing their potential, fully utilizing their gifts, and taking their relationship with God to the next level. They'll convince themselves and each other that their desire for expanded authority is actually evidence of their spiritual maturity, rather than a warning sign of approaching separation. The fourth marker is perhaps the most subtle: the redefinition of love. The future rebels will begin to argue that true love requires complete freedom, including freedom from divine restrictions. They'll suggest that God's boundaries, no matter how lovingly established, ultimately limit their ability to express genuine affection and worship. They'll claim that voluntary submission loses its meaning when certain choices are taken off the table entirely. This redefinition will seem profoundly spiritual because it will be couched in language about authentic relationship and mature love. The rebels will argue that they want to love God more perfectly, not less, and that such perfect love requires the freedom to choose alternatives, even if they would never actually exercise that freedom. It's a philosophical and the very foundation of divine authority position that sounds noble, but ultimately underm. The fifth and most dangerous marker is the beautiful alternative. This is when the future rebels begin to construct detailed visions of what existence could be like if certain divine restrictions were modified or removed. These aren't fantasies about sin or rebellion, as we understand them, but rather elaborate blueprints for alternative forms of perfection. They'll envision realms where redeemed consciousness can explore every possibility without limitation, where creativity knows no bounds, where love expresses itself through complete autonomy rather than willing submission. These visions will be breathtakingly beautiful, intellectually compelling, and seemingly consistent with everything they know about God's character and desires for His creation. The tragedy is that these alternative visions will contain just enough truth to be believable. God does want His children to be creative. He does desire their growth and development. He does value their freedom and individuality. But the beautiful alternative will take these true desires and extend them beyond the boundaries that God has established for reasons that transcend even perfected understanding. As these markers manifest and intensify, the prophecies describe how the division will become increasingly apparent to all the redeemed. Those who remain committed to divine submission will begin to sense something unsettling about their questioning companions, while those drawn toward independence will start to view the submissive ones as spiritually immature or unnecessarily restricted. The ancient texts warn that this division will be the source of the deepest grief the redeemed will experience in their eternal existence. Unlike earthly separations, which are softened by hope for eventual reunion, this division will be recognized by all parties as permanent and irreversible. The rebels won't be departing in anger or hatred, but in genuine conviction that they're pursuing a higher form of existence. The faithful won't be rejecting the rebels out of judgment or condemnation, but out of an equally genuine conviction that true fulfillment can only be found in perfect submission to divine will. But here's where the prophecy reveals something that challenges our current understanding of God's nature. The texts suggest that even God Himself will experience something analogous to what we might call doubt during this period. Not doubt about His own nature or decisions, but a kind of divine wrestling with the question of whether He should intervene more directly to prevent the separation. The prophecy describes moments when God will be tempted to use His absolute power to compel the rebels to remain in fellowship with Him. He'll consider revealing additional truths that might satisfy their questions, or expanding their creative authority to levels that might prevent their departure. But ultimately, He'll choose to honor their freedom even when that freedom leads them away from Him, because coerced love ceases to be love at all. This divine restraint will be observed by all the redeemed and will become one of the final tests of their own character. Those who truly understand the nature of love will recognize God's restraint as the ultimate expression of His respect for conscious beings. Those who are moving toward rebellion will interpret His restraint as evidence that He's either unable or unwilling to provide what they truly need for complete fulfillment. The prophecy describes how this interpretation of divine restraint will become the final catalyst for open separation. The rebels will conclude that God's refusal to grant their requests for expanded authority proves that he doesn't fully trust them or doesn't truly want them to reach their highest potential. They'll decide that genuine love requires them to seek fulfillment elsewhere, not in opposition to God, but independently of His direct oversight. And so the second war in heaven will begin not with violence or dramatic confrontation, but with a gradual exodus. The rebels will begin to withdraw from communal worship, from collaborative projects, from the shared activities that have characterized eternal life up to that point. They'll explain their withdrawal as a temporary measure, necessary for them to explore new possibilities and develop their independent capabilities. But the prophecy makes clear that this withdrawal will become permanent, as the rebels discover that they can't maintain their independence while remaining in close fellowship with God. His presence will serve as a constant reminder of the submission they've rejected, making it impossible for them to fully embrace their chosen path. Gradually, they'll request greater distance, more autonomy, more separation from divine influence. The faithful will watch this exodus with profound sorrow, not because they judge the rebels as evil, but because they recognize the tragic nature of their choice. They'll see beings they love walking away from the source of all life and joy, convinced they're moving toward something better when they're actually moving toward a form of existence that will ultimately prove hollow and unsatisfying. The ancient texts describe how the final separation will occur when the rebels make a formal request to establish their own realm, their own form of governance, their own interpretation of what eternal existence should look like. They'll present this request not as rebellion against God's authority, but as a mature recognition that their vision of perfection differs from His, and that true love requires allowing each party to pursue their own understanding of ultimate good. God will grant their request, not out of anger or disappointment, but out of perfect love and respect for their freedom. He'll create a separate space within eternity, where they can pursue their independent existence without interference from His direct presence. But He'll also ensure that this separation is complete and irreversible, because partial separation would only prolong their agony and prevent them from fully experiencing the consequences of their choice. The prophecy describes this moment of final separation as the second sorrow, a grief so profound that it will create new dimensions of reality simply to contain it. Unlike the first sorrow, when humanity fell and God had hope for eventual redemption, this sorrow will be final because the rebels will be choosing separation with full knowledge of its consequences and complete understanding of what they're giving up. But even in this ultimate tragedy, the ancient texts speak of a purpose being served. The second war in heaven will finally answer the question that has haunted conscious existence since the first rebellion: whether beings can find true fulfillment independently of their Creator. The rebels will have eternity to explore every possibility, to create every conceivable form of beauty and meaning, to push the boundaries of independent existence to their absolute limits. And their ultimate failure to find lasting satisfaction in independence will serve as an eternal testimony to the truth that God has maintained from the beginning: that conscious beings can only find their ultimate purpose and fulfillment in perfect relationship with Him. The second rebels won't become demons or forces of evil, but they will become living proof that even perfected beings cannot transcend their need for divine relationship without losing something essential to their nature. The prophecy concludes with a vision of two eternal realms existing in complete separation. In one realm, those who chose submission will experience ever-increasing intimacy with God, ever-expanding understanding of His nature, and ever-deeper joy in His presence. Their creativity and growth will know no bounds, because it will be perfectly aligned with divine will and purpose. In the other realm, the rebels will create increasingly elaborate structures of meaning and beauty, but these creations will ultimately collapse under the weight of their own emptiness because they'll be disconnected from the source of all genuine meaning and purpose. The rebels will spend eternity starting over, building new civilizations and philosophies and art forms, only to watch them crumble when they inevitably confront the fundamental emptiness at their core. And yet, according to these ancient prophecies, even this tragic outcome serves God's ultimate purpose. The existence of the second realm will provide an eternal reminder to those who remain faithful of what they've been saved from, not just from sin and death as they understood it in their earthly existence, but from the far more subtle tragedy of choosing independence over intimacy, creativity over communion, self-determination over divine love. The text suggests that knowledge of the second realm will actually increase the joy of those who remain faithful, not because they take pleasure in others' suffering, but because they'll understand more deeply than ever before the precious nature of what they've chosen to embrace. They'll see that their submission to God's will wasn't a limitation on their freedom, but the very thing that made true freedom possible. But perhaps the most sobering aspect of this entire prophecy is its implications for us in our current existence. If the second war in heaven is truly inevitable, if even perfected beings in paradise can choose separation from God, then what does this mean for our own spiritual journey? How do we guard against the subtle markers of rebellion that could manifest even in our current pursuit of holiness? The ancient texts provide what they call the disciplines of eternal submission, practices that can root us so deeply in divine relationship that we'll be prepared to choose correctly when the ultimate test arrives. These aren't additional religious duties or spiritual exercises, but fundamental orientations of heart and mind that align us with God's nature rather than our own understanding. But understanding these disciplines and their eternal significance requires us to delve even deeper into the mystery of what it truly means to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, not just in our current imperfect state, but in the perfected existence that awaits all who choose to remain in Him for all eternity. The first discipline the ancient texts describe is what they call the practice of perpetual wonder. This isn't about maintaining childish naivety, but about cultivating a deep recognition that no matter how much we learn about God, no matter how intimate our relationship becomes, there will always be infinite depths yet to explore. Those who will remain faithful through the second testing understand that growth in knowledge should increase their awe, not diminish their dependence. Even now, in our earthly existence, we can observe how some believers become dangerously comfortable with mystery. They begin to treat God's inscrutability as a problem to be solved rather than a glory to be celebrated. They start to believe that their theological education or spiritual experiences have qualified them to comprehend divine motivations fully. The prophecies warn that this attitude, seemingly harmless in our current state, becomes the seed of rebellion in the perfected state. The practice of perpetual wonder involves regularly acknowledging the limitations of even our most profound spiritual insights. It means celebrating the fact that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, His ways higher than our ways, not just in our fallen condition but eternally. Those who master this discipline find that their expanding knowledge leads them deeper into worship rather than closer to presumption. The second discipline is the cultivation of grateful dependence. This goes beyond simple thankfulness for God's blessings to include genuine appreciation for His ongoing oversight and guidance. The future rebels will struggle with this discipline because they'll begin to view their need for divine direction as evidence of immaturity rather than recognition of their proper place in creation. In our current existence, we can practice this discipline by actively seeking God's guidance in decisions we could easily make ourselves, by asking for His wisdom in situations where our own understanding seems adequate, and by regularly acknowledging our absolute dependence on His sustaining power for every breath we take. This isn't spiritual weakness, but spiritual wisdom that recognizes the true nature of the creature-creator relationship. Those who embrace grateful dependence discover something profound. the more they rely on God's guidance, the more capable they become, not less. Their abilities expand precisely because they remain rooted in the source of all ability. They learn that independence from God doesn't lead to greater effectiveness but to spiritual amnesia about where their gifts originated and how they're sustained. The third discipline the prophecies describe is the fellowship of mutual submission. This involves surrounding ourselves with others who share a commitment to divine authority and who will lovingly challenge any drift towards spiritual pride or independence. The ancient texts warn that isolation from such fellowship makes us vulnerable to the echo chambers that will characterize the pre-rebellion period. This discipline requires more than simply attending religious gatherings or participating in spiritual activities. It means forming deep relationships with people who will notice and address the subtle markers of approaching rebellion before they become entrenched patterns. It means giving others permission to question our motives, challenge our interpretations, and hold us accountable for our spiritual attitudes. The future faithful will be characterized by their eagerness to remain in fellowship with others who share their commitment to divine submission, while the future rebels will gradually distance themselves from such relationships, claiming they need more space for independent spiritual growth. Even now, we can observe how some believers begin to isolate themselves when their spiritual perspectives start to diverge from orthodox understanding. The fourth discipline is the practice of creative submission. This might seem like a contradiction, but the prophecies describe it as the key to experiencing true freedom within divine boundaries. Instead of viewing God's restrictions as limitations on creativity, this practice involves discovering the infinite possibilities that exist within His established parameters. Those who master this discipline learn that divine boundaries don't restrict creativity, but focus it in directions that lead to genuine fulfillment and lasting beauty. They discover that submission to God's will doesn't diminish their creative potential, but connects it to the source of all genuine creativity. Their art, their thinking, their relationships, and their service become expressions of divine nature rather than assertions of independent capability. The rebels, by contrast, will become obsessed with the creative possibilities that lie beyond established boundaries. They'll convince themselves that true creativity requires the freedom to explore every conceivable option, including those that God has declared off limits. They'll see divine restrictions as arbitrary limitations rather than loving protection from forms of existence that appear beautiful but ultimately lead to emptiness. The fifth and most crucial discipline is what the ancient texts call the love of God's glory above personal fulfillment. This is the deepest test of genuine faith because it requires choosing God's honor over our own satisfaction, His purposes over our own understanding, His timeline over our own desires. The second, rebels will fail this test because they'll gradually begin to prioritize their own sense of fulfillment over God's glory. This doesn't mean becoming passive or losing our individuality. Rather, it means aligning our deepest desires with God's purposes so completely that serving His glory becomes our greatest source of personal satisfaction. It means loving Him for who He is rather than for what He provides, honoring Him for His nature rather than for His benefits. Those who practice this discipline discover something remarkable. The more they prioritize God's glory over their own fulfillment, the more fulfilled they actually become. They learn that genuine satisfaction comes not from getting what we want, but from wanting what God wants. They find that self-denial paradoxically leads to the truest form of self-realization. But here's where these disciplines reveal their eternal significance. The prophecies suggest that those who practice them faithfully in our current existence will be prepared for the ultimate test that awaits in the perfected state. When the questions arise about divine limitations, when the beautiful alternatives are presented, when the choice between independence and intimacy must be made, these disciplines will have created such deep roots of submission that rebellion will be literally unthinkable. The ancient texts describe how these disciplines will manifest in the eternal state with even greater intensity. The faithful will experience perpetual wonder, not just at God's greatness, but at the privilege of participating in His purposes. Their grateful dependence will deepen into forms of communion that we can barely imagine in our current existence. Their fellowship will expand to include perfect unity with all other submitted beings across all of creation. Their creative submission will flower into expressions of beauty and meaning that perfectly reflect divine nature while showcasing the unique personality and gifts of each individual creator. And their love of God's glory will become the organizing principle around which all their activities and relationships revolve, creating a harmony of purpose that generates ever-increasing joy for all participants. Meanwhile, those who reject these disciplines will find themselves increasingly isolated from this growing symphony of submitted worship. Their questions about divine restrictions will multiply rather than resolve. Their desire for independence will intensify rather than satisfy. Their alternative visions will become more elaborate, but also more hollow, lacking the substance that can only come from connection to the source of all meaning. The prophecy describes how this divergence will accelerate over the vast ages of eternity until it reaches a point of no return. Those moving toward rebellion will become so invested in their independent vision that they'll be unable to imagine any other form of existence. Those growing in submission will become so rooted in divine relationship that separation from God will be literally inconceivable to them. And this brings us to perhaps the most startling revelation in these ancient texts. The identity of those most likely to lead and join the second rebellion isn't who you might expect. The prophecies don't describe the rebels as the weak or immature, but as some of the most gifted, intelligent, and spiritually sophisticated of the redeemed. They'll be beings who excelled in their earthly existence, who demonstrated remarkable faith and creativity, who seemed destined for positions of great honor in the eternal kingdom. But their very giftedness will become their vulnerability. Their intelligence will convince them that they can comprehend divine motivations fully. Their creativity will make them restless with existing forms of expression. Their spiritual sophistication will lead them to believe they've outgrown the need for external guidance. Their past successes will create confidence in their ability to chart their own course through eternity. The texts describe these future rebels with something approaching sympathy, recognizing that their rebellion will spring not from obvious moral failure, but from the subtle pride that can infect even the most devoted hearts. They'll genuinely believe they're honoring God by refusing to remain in what they perceive as spiritual childhood. They'll see their rebellion as graduation rather than regression. This revelation carries profound implications for our current spiritual formation. If the most gifted and sophisticated believers are most vulnerable to ultimate rebellion, then giftedness itself requires special vigilance. Intelligence needs to be balanced with humility. Creativity must be anchored in submission. Spiritual maturity should increase our sense of dependence rather than independence. The prophecy suggests that those most likely to remain faithful through the second testing will be characterized not by their exceptional gifts, but by their exceptional gratitude and humility. They'll be beings who never forgot what they were saved from, who maintained their sense of wonder at being included in God's purposes, who continued to see themselves as unworthy recipients of divine grace rather than qualified participants in divine governance. These faithful ones won't be less intelligent or creative than the rebels. In many cases, they'll be equally gifted, but they'll have learned to hold their gifts lightly, recognizing them as trust from God rather than personal achievements. They'll have developed the habit of referring all their capabilities back to their source, maintaining a constant awareness of their absolute dependence on divine sustenance. The ancient texts describe how this fundamental difference in attitude will determine the ultimate division. When the choice between independence and intimacy is finally presented in its starkest form, Those who have maintained their sense of grateful dependence will find the choice obvious. Of course, they want to remain close to the source of all life and joy. Of course, they prefer intimacy with their Creator over autonomy from Him. But those who have gradually developed confidence in their own capabilities will find the choice genuinely difficult. They'll see merits in both options. They'll struggle to understand why they can't have both intimacy and independence, both divine relationship and personal autonomy. Their very struggle with the choice will reveal how far they've drifted from true understanding of their nature and purpose, and this struggle will be prolonged over ages, as the prophecy describes the patient way God will work with each questioning soul, answering their concerns, demonstrating His love, showing them the ultimate consequences of both paths. He won't rush the decision or force a premature choice, because the choice itself is too important to be made under pressure or without full understanding. But eventually, the choice will have to be made. The competing visions of eternal existence will prove incompatible, and every conscious being will have to decide which vision they want to embrace permanently. The texts describe this as the moment when eternity itself will hold its breath, waiting to see how the children of redemption will choose to spend their endless existence. Those who choose continued submission will discover that their choice opens doors to experiences and relationships and forms of creativity they never imagined possible. Their intimacy with God will deepen into dimensions that have no parallel in current existence. Their relationships with one another will achieve levels of harmony and mutual understanding that create new forms of joy and satisfaction. Their creative expressions will become genuine collaborations with divine creativity, producing works of beauty and meaning that reflect both human personality and divine nature in perfect synthesis. Their service will expand into forms of participation in cosmic governance that honor both their enhanced capabilities and their continued dependence on divine wisdom. But those who choose independence will discover something tragic about their choice. The very autonomy they sought will gradually isolate them not just from God, but from one another. Without the unifying principle of divine submission, their individual visions of perfect existence will prove incompatible, leading to fragmentation and conflict even among the rebels themselves. Their creative expressions, no matter how elaborate or beautiful, will ultimately feel hollow because they'll lack connection to the source of all meaning. Their relationships will become increasingly superficial because without shared submission to divine authority, there will be no foundation for genuine unity or mutual trust. The prophecy describes how the rebels will spend ages trying to solve these problems through ever more sophisticated forms of organization and ever more elaborate philosophical systems. They'll create constitutions and governments and social structures designed to maintain harmony without divine authority. But all these efforts will ultimately fail because they'll be trying to create meaning and purpose from within rather than receiving it from above. And gradually, over periods of time that dwarf human history, the rebels will come to understand what they've chosen. They'll realize that their desire for independence has led them not to a higher form of existence, but to a beautiful form of emptiness. They'll see that their sophisticated rebellion has produced not greater freedom, but more subtle forms of bondage. But by this point, the choice will be irreversible. Not because God refuses to accept them back, but because they'll have become so identified with their independence that submission will feel like annihilation. They'll have spent so much time and energy constructing their autonomous existence that abandoning it will seem impossible, even when they recognize its ultimate futility. The ancient texts describe this as the final tragedy of the second war in heaven. Unlike the first rebellion, which was motivated by obvious pride and resulted in clear evil, the second rebellion will be motivated by apparently noble aspirations, and will result in something much more subtle and heartbreaking: the eternal pursuit of meaning by beings who have voluntarily cut themselves off from the only source from which genuine meaning can flow. And so the prophecy concludes where it began, with a question that echoes across eternity and reaches even into our current existence. When the ultimate choice is presented, when the beautiful alternative is offered, when independence beckons with all its apparent promise of greater fulfillment and expanded possibility, which will you choose? Will you cling to the relationship that has sustained you through every previous test? Or will you reach for the autonomy that promises to elevate you beyond the need for such dependence? The answer to that question, according to these ancient prophecies, will determine not just your eternal destiny, but the very nature of existence itself for ages to come. Because the second war in heaven isn't just about individual choices. It's about the fundamental question of whether conscious beings can find ultimate fulfillment independently of their Creator. And your choice will contribute to the eternal answer that question receives. The time for preparation is now. The disciplines that will sustain you through the ultimate testing must be cultivated in your current existence. The choice that awaits in the distant future of paradise is being shaped by every choice you make today about whether to seek your own will or submit to divine authority, whether to trust your own understanding or rely on God's wisdom, whether to pursue your own glory or prioritize His. The veil has been lifted, the prophecy has been revealed, and now you stand at the threshold of the most profound question any soul will ever face. Not tomorrow, not in some distant eternity, but right now, in this very moment. Because the second war in heaven isn't just a future event, it's a present reality unfolding in the chambers of your heart every single day. Every time you choose submission over independence, every time you embrace wonder over presumption, every time you prioritize His glory above your own fulfillment, you're casting your vote for which side you'll stand on when paradise itself becomes a battlefield. The disciplines aren't just preparation. They're participation in the war that's already begun. If this revelation has shaken you to your core, if you feel the weight of eternity pressing against your soul, then let that trembling drive you to your knees. Because the God who will one day allow a second rebellion is the same God who offers you grace right now to choose differently. The choice that will echo through countless ages begins with the choice you make today. Share this truth with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video if it's opened your eyes to mysteries you never knew existed. Subscribe because there are more hidden prophecies waiting to be unveiled. But most importantly, choose. Choose submission. Choose dependence. Choose the relationship that will sustain you when everything else crumbles into beautiful emptiness. The second war in heaven is coming. The only question is which army you'll join. Choose wisely. Eternity is watching.